Says Mark Kenny. Thanks, Mark. Thank you. Thank you. Anyway, I'm going to bring in right away Mr. Derek Shelmerdine, the man who's written all this rock and roll unravelled. And here he is. Here he is. I can't get it.
Hey. Hi, Frank. You are live. Definitely, mate.
I can't get the big screen. I don't know what to do. I haven't a clue. Still there. Still in the process of learning. I've been like this for about 25 years. It still hasn't penetrated. Anyway, how are you? How are you liking the weather?
Oh, it's wonderful. I love this sort of weather. You know, wandering around, nice and warm, good excuse to have a beer. Perfect.
Yes. Yeah. You know, you're right there because there are lots of
Hi, Mark.
There are lots of people who are going out on the holidays. There's a lad who I'm in touch with called Steve Mulholland. When we were having all the goods, I mean, he was in the Dominican Republic, and he came back and he said, "It's this morning." He said, "Where's the sun? Where's the sun? Everybody's been talking about." You know, so. But it's funny, isn't it? You know, some of the heat and everything else, what we've had, which is it's a godsend, actually. It's a godsend because, you know, we're not saying we're a miserable country, but it is, isn't it? The weather's always miserable. I remember this, Derek. I was going to have a barbecue one you know, you just pick a month, don't you? I was going to bring friends around, special friends, and it was a July. Never forget it. I said, I'm going to have a barbecue on a Saturday, and it'll run into the night, you know, so that there be no work and things like that for people, myself included. And every Saturday in that July, rained. It just lashed down. So we couldn't have couldn't have it. But anyway, we've got this musical thing that you're going to talk about. Can you tell the viewers and the listeners what it's all about tonight, please?
Well, it's quite an interesting one in a way that we're talking about Tommy Sands, basically, who was a big star in the 50s and part of the 60s. But he's not one of those names that people know an awful lot about. But there are a couple of really interesting angles to tonight's conversation. I mean, one is that he was also managed by Colonel Parker, the guy that managed Elvis, and Parker managed Tommy Sands before he managed Elvis. And if you look at the two careers, Elvis actually treads in the footsteps as though he's going through a minefield, and Tommy Sands has gone through first, and Elvis, virtually every step of the way until he finds fame, follows exactly the same route as Tommy Sands, and they both have very, very similar backgrounds. Both given guitars at a very early age by their mothers. Both started performing really quite early. Both have a religious background, both big churchgoers back in the day. So the other side is, if you look at Tommy Sands' career, it very much falls into four distinct parts. I mean, the guy was a child star. At 10 years old in 1947, he was appearing on a TV show in Chicago, Lady of the Mountains, when they lived there. And then it was really 1957 when he found fame with a TV show, and then the hit records came. And then you get to 1960 where he marries Nancy Sinatra. And that was an interesting time. I mean, his Billboard Top 40 hits had dried up by 1960, but he was still really quite active. And he very much turned to acting as well in the 1960s. And then it really all fell apart for him. He got divorced from Nancy Sinatra in 65. And that's very much where it all fell apart.
I mean, Elsie's just come in. She's just doing a message for me.
Right.
Oh, not good. Who's that?
Me.
Oh, is it? I thought it was it.
Yeah.
She just showed me a photograph of herself when she's Sophie's age. Yeah, I just pop in and say hello to Derek.
No. Me? Oh, never look like me now. According to right.
Say hello to her, Derek. Come.
Hi, Derek.
Come on.
Hi.
Come
How
here.
you keeping?
Here's my granddaughter. Here's my little granddaughter. And say hello.
Oh.
Hi.
Say hello.
Yeah.
Say hello, Derek.
Hi.
She's shy.
Hi.
She's shy.
Fame and
It was
fortune.
her birthday yesterday, you see.
Oh, brilliant.
So she brought me down a cake, and I've just given her some money.
Well, you can never go wrong with a cake. Oh, perfect.
All right. Sophia. Right, I'm going.
I'll see you later.
I'll see you later.
Bye,
I'll ring you later.
Bye-bye, baby.
So,
Don't forget to leave me keys, Francie.
the keys are on the chair next to you.
Okay. Ta-ra, babe. Ta-ra, Sophia. The lad's interrupted. I said, I've got my show in about 10 minutes. That's why I was a little bit late coming on. Anyway, we're talking about Tommy Sands, aren't we? Can I come in with something? And
Absolutely.
This is why I asked you to do Tommy Sands. I always thought, with him being married to Nancy Sinatra,
Yep.
because he made a few films and he was one of these like
Absolutely.
young stars, that
Yeah.
put in with big stars as well, put in with in major films. And I think Sinatra had a lot to do with that, putting them in, promoting them, because he was Nancy, his daughter, because he adored his daughter, didn't he?
Yeah.
Nancy. And the next, you never heard of him. And the next, you heard that they were getting divorced. So, if I'm right or wrong or whatever, carry on about
Yeah, if you sort of pick the story up towards the end, as it were, with Nancy Sinatra, I mean, that's really quite interesting. In fact, I mean, he did make a bunch of Hollywood movies, a lot of which aren't particularly well known, a lot of which didn't make a lot of money. I mean, he did star in some big movies. I mean, he was one of the many stars in The Longest Day in 1962. This sort of mid-60s era was very much his time for success on the TV and the movies. He was well known for Babes in Toyland in 61, a Disney film, and None But the Brave in 65.
Yeah,
but the Sinatra one's interesting because in 63, Sinatra invited him to be in his movie Come Blow Your Horn, and Tommy Sands turned him down. And I'm not 100% sure whether Tommy Sands and Frank Sinatra ever really got on. I mean, what happened in 1960, Nancy Sinatra married, and obviously met a little bit before that, but she dropped out of college to be with Tommy Sands, because he was really quite a star at this particular point, so he's out and about all the time. And Frank Sinatra apparently was never too happy about that. He always felt that Nancy should go on and should have finished really her career. But as far as I can gather, in the early days, he respected the fact that Nancy was very much in love with Tommy Sands. I think all seems to be well. To be honest, when I've been sort of delving into the background for our conversation, it's very difficult to get a real handle on the relationship there, because Nancy Sinatra was releasing singles at that time herself. I mean, she released the first one in 61, and then she had a dozen singles, 11 I think, before Boots. These Boots Were Made for Walking was a big hit on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, it was #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. Again, we're not doing this chronologically at all. I mean, he had his hit singles, Billboard hit singles in the late 50s, and Nancy Sinatra's didn't actually start. I mean, Boots was 1966, and when I was reading about the divorce today, what it was an interview. Well, I wasn't reading. I found this interview this reporter guy had with Nancy Sinatra, and one of the reasons for the breakup apparently was that, like Elvis, Tommy Sands got into prescription drugs, and it appears there was a lot of. In this interview, she keeps saying how naive she was, and at the time she had no idea sort of what was going on, and you get the impression that there was quite a bit of drug stuff going on in the background that quite possibly led up to the divorce. And the interesting other thing I've never found a definitive answer to either is that one of the reasons that's given that his career absolutely collapsed in 1967 after the divorce. And one of the reasons that gets quoted is that he was blacklisted. Frank Sinatra got him blacklisted in Hollywood because, I mean, I won't say quite overnight, but over a very short period of time, his music career and acting career ground to a screeching halt. And I've also seen interviews where it says that both Sinatra and Sands deny there was any blacklisting. I think it's one of those situations where, I mean, somebody somewhere will know what actually went on, but there's an awful lot of contradiction going on. I think that for me, that's one of the fascinating things about Tommy Sands, how he was very, well, because if I say he was a child star, I mean, he was in that TV show when he was 10 years old. I mean, that is a child star by any definition. Years old, and this is where the similarity with Elvis is very strong, is that the Grand Ole Opry is the spiritual home of country music in America. And back in the sort of 40s and 50s, the Grand Ole Opry was the big radio stroke TV show. And its big competitor in Shreveport, Louisiana, was the Louisiana Hayride show. And that was where Elvis basically got his break. That's where he developed his name. I mean, funny enough, he had one appearance on the Grand Ole Opry, and he did not go down well. In fact, famously, the manager of the Opry said to him he should stick to driving a truck. But a couple of weeks later, literally, he made his first appearance on the Louisiana Hayride, and he was a big success. In fact, he made 5 singles for Sun Records, and 3 of those 10 sides actually hit the national Billboard Country top 40. So, I mean, Elvis was very much came out of the country route as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. I was going to, excuse me for interrupting, but I was going to ask you that because you've got Elvis.
Yeah.
And, people call him the king of rock and roll.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Then you've got, if you put YouTube on and you put country music on, Elvis comes on, right? And then if you look a little bit further, gospel comes on. So what really was he? Was he just an all-round singer, or I just don't know. I can't put my finger on it.
Yeah, I mean they had. They both had a religious background. They both sang in church choirs, regular churchgoers and the like. And I mean, Elvis, the gospel, he very nearly joined a couple of different gospel bands. In fact, he failed an audition for one of them because they felt that he wasn't a team player, as it were. He couldn't harmonize, which sounds a bit ironic, but. They did offer him the job later, sadly, when a couple of them were killed in a plane crash and there was a vacancy. Yeah. But by then, his first rock and roll singles with Sun had really started to. Do
you know what? You're talking about Buddy Holly there, died in a plane crash and things like that. Yeah. Did Elvis like them? Like their music, or the likes of Eddie Cochran? Did he like Eddie Cochran? I just don't know who Elvis liked.
Oh yeah, I think he was. He liked all of those contemporaries. I think. I mean, a lot of his influence came from the country singers. Old Shep was the first song he ever performed in public. He entered a talent show and I can't remember offhand, around about 10 years old, and he came 5th apparently. but you know, he had a lot of success there. And if you look at the Billboard Top 40 R&B hits, a lot of his, particularly early stuff, actually charted in the R&B charts as well. I mean, I think it was, I'm pretty sure Heartbreak Hotel, his first national hit when he joined RCA. I'm pretty sure that was a hit on the country charts, the the pop chart, Hot 100, and the R&B chart as well. So, you know, he had a very, very varied background. Actually, you mentioned King of Rock and Roll. I got an interesting fact for you. That possibly comes from an article written on the 4th of May, 1956, a newspaper article in the Press Scimitar, a guy called Robert Johnson, not the bluesman, obviously.
No.
And in the article, it refers to Elvis as the fledgling king of rock and roll. And 1956 was very much the big year for Elvis. I mean, he joined RCA, just and in November of 55, but he released Heartbreak Hotel, I think, in the January of 66. And that really broke him. I mean, you know, it went pretty much straight to the top. It was there for, you know, a long time. And if you look at the end of 1956, where at the beginning, like he was well known in the sort of southern states, Louisiana, Memphis, you know, Tennessee, you know, around his hometown towns. But at the end of 1956, he made his first movie. And in the December charts, what would be either the Christmas week or the week before Christmas, he had 10 singles in the Hot 100. So he went from zero to hero basically across 1956. So 56 was a critical year in Elvis's career.
Well, do you know what? Yeah, just as a text off Jason. He's telling you to, will you wind up? He said, you know, you're talking too much. I'm only joking. So he looked like, oh, sorry. Your face there. Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? You know, like as I said, I was confused. As I said, just going on YouTube, then all of a sudden, Blankets on the Ground came on there, Rhinestone Cowboy, then Elvis. And I went, God, this is all country music. And I mean, country music.
Very much so.
And then, you know, as I said, yeah, I played all types of music. I love me opera, I love me classical music. I grew up at that. And then, you know, we all rock and roll. Then Elvis his flame, and you know, along with Status Quo and Rainbow, and so you just see these I don't know, different types of music coming from the great man.
Oh, absolutely.
The great man. Who do you think influenced the Beatles more? Do you reckon? Oh, you know, Buddy Holly, Elvis.
Well,
any of them?
Well, I think Carl Perkins, they recorded 3 of Carl Perkins' songs. I think they liked him. I think they were big Buddy Holly fans as well. And I think it was that whole generation. I mean, they used to do a lot of R&B covers at the time. So I think they had quite a broad sort of background of taste there. And they were actually writing unlike a lot of bands, they were actually writing their own stuff quite early on.
The Beatles went a lot further than other bands and broke many boundaries, as in experimenting like backwards guitars.
Well, that's right. I think that's what makes the Beatles are in a league of their own. There's absolutely no two ways about that. I mean, there were lots of other great bands around at the time. But I think what's fascinating about the Beatles is that they almost, well, I wouldn't say follow the history of rock and roll, but they are completely in step with the history of rock and roll. I mean, they started out as a skiffle group, as the Quarrymen. They took on, as some of the skiffle groups like Lonnie Donegan and Wally Whiten and the likes. They stayed very much in the skiffle route, which was very much still part of the trad jazz and really had its roots in American rural blues, people like Leadbelly. But the 1950s Elvis, Eddie Cochran, the like, started influencing people like John Lennon. And a lot of the bands then moved away from skiffle bands, and most of the Mersey beat ones moved away from skiffle and became beat groups by the late 50s, early 60s. And then the Beatles were the first beat group to actually have a hit. They weren't the first beat group to release a single. There were several other groups that released singles year before the Beatles. I mean, the people that beat them to the Tremolos, Brian Poole and the Tremolos, that beat them to the audition at Decca Records on the 1st of January 62. They had their first record out, as you'd imagine, about 3 months later.
Was it Do You Love Me?
That was one of the early ones. I think that the first one was not Twist Little Sister, but it was a Twist song. Do You Love Me was very early on.
Because that was a big hit for them, wasn't it?
Yeah, and Dave Clark, actually. I think that was their first hit, Do You Love Me? And I remember Dave Clark actually released it as well at the same time, and either got the very low end of the charts
Dave
or not.
Clark 5 released that, did they?
Yeah, they released them about the same sort of time. Yeah. So, I mean, the Beatles were a good 6 months behind, well, 9 months behind Brian Poole, really, in terms of releasing a single. But Brian Poole's first 3 or 4 singles didn't chart. It was very much the Beatles' Love Me Do. That was the first beat group to chart in the October 62. And then, interestingly, the second beat group to chart was, again, the Beatles with Please Please Me in January or the February, I think. And then other people were having hits. And interestingly, from a sort of Liverpool point of view, before people like the Searchers, Billy J. Kramer, I nearly said Freddie and the Dreamers, but they're not really very Liverpool. Round the corner. Well, Jerry and the Pacemakers. Before any of them hit the charts, the Big Three.
The Big Three.
I mean, it wasn't a particularly big hit, but interesting enough, they were very early on in those days. And then as the 60s developed, and you get to 64, 65, and the Beats music was starting to wind down a little, because what was happening around 65, 66 particularly, was that it got a much harder blues edge, and rock music emerged. And most of the early 60s beat groups sort of faded away. I mean, an awful lot of them are still working on the circuits now on the strength of that. But what happened was that very few of the groups from the first half of the 60s made it into the second half. I mean, most of the ones that did were people who wrote their own music. People like the Who, the Kinks, and the Rolling Stones, of course. And they made that transition into the world of rock music. And of course, you've got psychedelia coming out then, so 67. You've got new bands like the Floyd coming in. But the Beatles kept right at the forefront of where popular music was in 66, 65, 66, 67. So if you look at that period between sort of Rubber Soul and Sgt. Pepper, I mean, it was across that period that the music went through a seismic change. In fact, Rubber Soul, the other thing that's interesting there as well is that Rubber Soul was the first album, the UK version of it, was the first album where they wrote all their own material. And that was another trend of the sort of second half of the 60s. An awful lot of the bands that were being successful then wrote an awful lot of their own music. There was much, much less covering of American, particularly R&B and blues, which if you look at the beat groups, the majority of the songs were covers of American material. So, and then of course, the Beatles stopped touring. I mean, in 65, 66, And you know, so they stayed as a studio band after that, which, you know, is pretty much unheard of, because in those days it was the tours that promoted the and it's totally different now. People make money on tours and nobody makes any money out of the records. Back in the day then, the bands made their money on the tours, on the albums and the odd single, and they
but it was to promote them anyway, wasn't it? And it was to promote themselves.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned Freddie. I thought they were awful. Them, I thought they were. And I'm sorry about that, but you know, I'm sorry, Freddie Garrity, but I thought you were dreadful. I'm not saying it. But when you get the likes of those bands, didn't they go out to promote themselves as well? The more you're on stage, the more fans you get, and you know, the more records you come out, they'll be more. I just want to go through some comments and just go above here. This and it's lovely, Leah Boner. She says, "Hi, Leah," because she's a very good friend of mine. Grew up more or less together. Leah. Oh, that's lovely. Leah, all the way from Atlanta. Elvis says, Monty Connor, still the king here in America.
Absolutely.
That's what he says.
Yeah.
And this is, I think this is advertisements all the way from Germany. And this is a good friend of mine as well. Albie Donnelly. He used to be, well, he still is. He's in Supercharged, the big sax player. Brilliant as well. He's a fantastic sax player. And he says, all right, Frank, glad to see you wearing a summer shirt. It's good to see. Just a quick mention about the Blob Holstery, former Yeater's Wine Lodge. I always visit a venue of many happy memories when I return from my exotic travels, entertaining music fans and appreciators of my singing, saxophone and talent. Anyway, I digress. The Guinness in the Blob is over £1.50 cheaper for a pint than in the Philharmonic pub. So, as far as I'm concerned, the historic Victorian is not worth the £1.50 extra. It's a bloody... How about that for a little piece of history? He's great, honestly. I had him on my show once, and I said, would you like a drink? And he was sitting with me, you know. He said, yeah, I wouldn't mind. I said, would you like tea or coffee? And he went, have you got any beer? Oh, he said, have you got stuff today? I said, do you want some orange juice? He said, have you got any beer? I said, yeah, I've got a few. And he was for orange, yeah. Anyway, he drank them all. He got a taxi wherever he was going after that. Great fella, love him. Right, so Charlie Woods, evening lads, hope you're both keeping well. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you. Wally Whiten with Ollie Beak. Yeah, that's right, that isn't it? Yeah, there's a great historian, David Owens. Not forgetting Elvis was also a ballad singer. His first love, Love Me Tender, he sang the title song. A ballad singer. You wouldn't think that of Elvis, though, would you?
I think that's one of Elvis's great strengths, is the actual range of his voice. And interestingly enough, the two, just to go back to Tommy Sands for a minute, I mean, what happened was, when Colonel Parker started managing Tommy Sands in 1953, and in essence, he then got involved with Elvis. And there is a school of thought that Elvis and Tommy Sands actually played on the same bill in the January of 55. The Shreveport, Louisiana Hayride people, they used to put several band singers together and do concerts. And on one particular one in Houston, Texas, I read that they're on the same bill. And I also saw a quote that said that it was Tommy Sands that sort of alerted Colonel Parker, his manager at the time, to Elvis, and that he should check him out. I mean, there are many stories about how the Colonel gets involved with Elvis. But what happened was when the Colonel took over Elvis, he agreed that Elvis would be his only client. So, you know, Tommy Sands went elsewhere. And I wouldn't sort of go as far as say into the wilderness for the next few years, but he changed a few record labels. And what happened in 1950, well, it must have been late 56, there was this episode of craft theatre, television theatre, a bit like armchair theatre, I think. And there was an episode called The Singing Idol. And it was very much and this is like 1957, January, and it was very much, you know, a Colonel Parker type manager and an Elvis Presley, you know, rapid meteoric rise to fame kind of play. And even though the Colonel wasn't managing him, and he hadn't managed him for the best part of a couple of years, I think, he helped through his contacts get Sands, you know, the key role as the singer in a film called The Singing Idol. And that's really what broke his careers into, you know, great success in America. The song in it's shown being recorded in Capitol Studios. He'd moved on from RCA by now to Capitol Records, called Teenage Crush. And it gave him his first hit record. It got to #2. But what's interesting is he only ever had 4 American hits, and it was on 3 singles. His second single, the A side and the B side, were both hits. And then it was the third single was from another one of those craft TV shows, and the 4th single was from a movie version that was made in 1958 of The Singing Idol, and they called that Sing Boy Sing. And I found copies of both of these on the internet. So earlier today, I actually watched them to you know, see what they're all about, and they were really quite fascinating. It very much the movie Sing Boy Sing. A lot of the dialogue was exactly the same because it was longer. They introduced another character, and there were very minor differences, but it was very much the same story. It had a slightly happier ending, I noticed, the Hollywood movie version than the TV one that preceded it. But what was really interesting about the Singing Idol when you watch it was it really showed what life was like in 1957. I mean, for instance, there's a scene on an aeroplane where they're flying from A to B, and lots of people are smoking on that. You know, I mean, you think now, you know, if somebody lights a cigarette in midair, we're all going to die. Well, you know, I mean, that was very much the norm at the time. And the other thing was great was that it showed them in Capitol Studios in the play recording the song Teenage Crush, and the session musicians were all wearing ties and jackets and trousers and stuff. And I was doing some stuff on an American sessions set of people, the Phil Spector people, called the Wrecking Crew. And I read the origin of why they called themselves the Wrecking Crew, because what had happened, these sort of old guard session musicians, pretty by and large, had classical training backgrounds. They played a lot of jazz, and you know, it's very different being a sort of rock and roll drummer to being a jazz drummer. You know, you tend to find, I mean, some drummers can play in lots of different genres, but there is a lot of difference to get the right feel to things like that. And it was Hal Blaine, famous drummer, did a lot of stuff with Elvis, interestingly enough. The old guys would be saying, "Oh, you're going to wreck the business." So Hal Blaine coined the name Wrecking Crew for the session musicians. And these are the guys that were Phil Spector's house band as well.
It's surprising, isn't it? You know, when you're researching all this, and it's like my history, you know, over the years I'm talking about, you know, you start researching and you've got this other idea or this other thing that you've read, which is completely and utterly wrong, if you know what I mean, until you do the research yourself. And the lad on there, David Owens, he knows quite well, because he's a historian too. So when you look at these things, especially researching singers. Now,
Mm.
I didn't even know Tommy, the Colonel's protege. I didn't know that. I really didn't know that. Him and Elvis. That comes
Yeah,
as a shock as well. So it's things
yeah.
like that, little odd things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the Colonel's a really interesting guy. He came over to America. But the general story is he came over to America in the 1920s, fleeing from possibly having killed somebody. But if there's any lawyers listening, that's very much a rumor. Nobody believes a word of it. And so one of the theories that he didn't like Elvis to travel was because he didn't have a passport, and he was always he was always concerned that if he left the country, he might not get back in.
Be allowed back in, yeah.
Yeah. But, he worked with Eddie Arnold, and it was when he parted company with Eddie Arnold, because the reason there seems to be that Eddie Arnold thought that the Colonel was a trifle overbearing. So decided to move on, as it were. And that was when he got involved, 1953, with Tommy Sands. And more coincidences. I mean, he signed Tommy Sands to RCA, which is where Eddie Arnold had been signed. So no surprise he'd have contacts there. And that was, of course, where he signed Elvis to. So another one of those footsteps through the minefield, in exactly the same route. They both released their first single on an independent label.
When did he become the manager of Elvis? Because what you've said there, about him couldn't get back in the country if he. Don't forget, he's have lawyers. I think he was a walk back in. I think that's a little bit of a.
Yeah, it's a bit powerful, I think. Yeah.
He just didn't want to see him go, did he? Because when he went to Germany in the army, what could he do? Did he go over to Germany?
No, he had no choice about that. I mean, they managed to postpone Elvis's, I was going to say enrollment, but being called up into the army by about 3 weeks or something, because he was finishing off the filming of King Creole. You mentioned about how Elvis got involved, and Tommy Sands. It was very straightforward. The Colonel recognised a talent, saw it, signed him up, and started to develop his career. With Elvis, it was an awful lot more complicated. Elvis was being managed at the time that the Colonel met Elvis. He was being managed by a guy called Bob Neal. He was actually Elvis's second manager. Elvis's first manager was his guitarist, Scotty Moore. He was, formally his manager. I've seen a copy of a facsimile of the contract. But Bob Neal was a big player in Memphis. He was a record shop owner. He was a DJ. He was quite a big promoter. He was one of the key promoters around there. And shortly after Elvis signed to Bob Neal, the Colonel got involved with him, and the Colonel signed a special agreement on the 15th of August 1955, which gave him the ability to assist in the management. He didn't become the manager, but he would start to get more actually involved in that. And then Colonel Parker, while Bob Neal was still the manager, Colonel Parker signed Elvis to RCA for $35,000, an extra $5,000 for Elvis. And then in the early part of 56, I think there's a lot more in the middle of this story. But Bob Neal could see basically that even though he was still technically the manager, Colonel Parker was very much in the driving seat. And he told Parker that he could no longer sort of accompany him on trips because of other things he was doing. And the way he signed up was really interesting because he was under 21. On the 21st of November 1955, the original contract was signed and countersigned by his mum and dad, Vernon and Gladys Presley. And you'll see on the same contract, there's something called approved, and then Bob Neal's name, and he signed to say, yes, this is legal. I know I'm a manager, but, I don't mind. Anyway, as soon as Elvis turned 21, in the March of 56, Colonel Parker renegotiated the deal. I mean, the deal was pretty much the same, but the only two signatories at the bottom of that contract were the king and the colonel.
Do you know
So-
what? Do you know when you mentioned when Elvis was 21?
Yeah.
I don't associate him with being 21. I always just assume, Elvis is Elvis. You never
Yes.
realise that, the signatories of, his parents, for their permission. And it's just amazing. It's just amazing, isn't it? Really, the way, we learn all these things. And it's like the Beatles. I was watching the Beatles the other day. I think it was with Francine. I was watching I was talking to Francine, and I said, when they were on the rooftop, the playing, I said, look at them. I said, they're only in the 20s there.
Yeah.
They're only in the 20s.
Yeah.
And she says, why do they look older? I said, no, I said, they look more mature because they've got the guitars. And I said, don't forget, it was the 31st of January. It was freezing.
Yeah.
Anyone would look a lot old, little icy blast coming at you and trying to play a guitar. So it's strange. We look at people, like I just said, Elvis, all as I remember is Elvis is singing, in Las Vegas. With Suspicious Minds and everything. It's fantastic. But you see him at that age.
Yeah.
Not as like a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. But he's still, with Elvis, he had absolute massive charisma. He ever did 3 TV specials, and the last one was literally weeks before he died, and he was quite chubby by then, and he would forget the words to songs, but he'd laugh at himself. The guy, self-effacing, fantastic, but that's last TV documentary is never officially run as a TV documentary. But again, the great thing with the movies in the sky is it's up there and it's not difficult to find. And
I know. Can I just come in there?
Absolutely.
I've seen a documentary. He was giving a live performance, but he was younger. He was dead slim because he has all this leather stuff on, and it was only a very small stage where you'd have people around.
Oh, that's the 68 comeback special.
And he went like that to me. He says, "You want me to?" The way he went like that with his lip.
Oh,
he said, "You want me to quiver the lip?" And he didn't take the mic out of himself and he loved his fans, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. And that charisma was there till the very, very end. That last show, which was weeks before he died, his voice was still very, very good, contrary to what you sometimes hear. But the communication and magnetism with the audience was absolutely awesome. The scarves into the audience, the ladies were all as enthusiastic as they had ever been for him, and the guy just had such massive stage presence.
He did, because as you said, charismatic. He was as you just said, though, you can't get away from what you just said about him. Being like picking holes in himself, but making fun of it, if you like. Because I forget who it was. It was Richard Harris, the actor.
Yeah.
He was talking to someone, and he said, my son always brought his little schoolmates home. He said, they're only kids. And they used to come in and they used to look at him and look up at him and go, when I walked in the room. And he said, I've got to do something about this because my son, he must be going around saying, look at my dad, look who my dad is. So he brought in some outtakes of himself, and he had this screen put up and everything, and he said, "Hey, kids, have a look at this." and everybody was laughing. All the kids was laughing. He said, because we're all fallible to mistakes. We're all fallible. He says, and that really, he says, you know, I felt sorry for my son. He said, but the kids loved it. And I wasn't this infallible, like, persona that was portrayed on screens or anything. And I thought that was great. And it's like Elvis. Elvis was the same. John Lennon.
Yeah.
John Lennon used to, you know, he used to poke fun as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's been,
Yeah.
you know, go ahead. I'm so
No,
you know.
One other thing. I mean, you know, the guy is Tommy Sands is a rated guy. He's got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He was inducted into the Rockabilly Hall of Fame. So, you know, the guy is rated. But what happened in 1967, his career completely went down the pan. He moved to Hawaii, lived there for a while. Apparently owned a sort of clothing company or line or something. But he used to perform then in the clubs. He got married again while he was in Hawaii. And then he returned to the mainland in 1981, Fort Wayne, Indiana. So, you know, the guy's had such a varied time. It's absolutely incredible. And look at listening to him in those two movies this morning, the guy had an awesome voice. He wasn't, in the rock and roll sense, he wasn't a Little Richard. He wasn't a Jerry Lee Lewis. He was a little bit Elvis. He was a little bit Pat Boone. He was a little bit Sinatra, you know, almost a crooner. He was more down the sort of, came slightly later, the teen idols, people like Fabian. So, you know, the guy was interesting because if you look at the timing of his career, you know, when the 60s came, very few people from the 1950s made that transition, like the mid 60s, early 60s to the late 60s. So he was from an era that was really swept away when the sort of second wave of rock and roll, beat music, surf music in America, Phil Spector, because America went a completely different route in the first half of the 60s. They didn't have beat groups. They had, you know, new dances like the Twist. They had Phil Spector. They had Bob Dylan. They had surf music. So, you know, they plowed their own furrow until 1964, 65 and 66. You know, it all came back together. So he was always, in a way, to the side. If you look at when his Tommy Sands, when his record career started, it was after his appearance in that Kraft theatre. And it was about a rock and roll singer. The song in the show gave him his first hit. He was in another show called Flesh and Blood, I think, and that gave him his third hit. And his fourth hit was from the film version of that first Kraft theatre. So his hits, by and large, were all tied into his theatrical performances. I mean, the guy's fascinating the more you delve into him.
It's incredible, isn't it? Charlie Wood says, remember, I'm going to read two other comments out. Remember when Elvis smashed his guitar in Jailhouse Rock? He smashed it and said, that'll teach them. I wonder if he said a roll system, you know, something like that, you know, very
exactly. Exactly. In a southern drawl.
Yeah. I think it was, no, I don't think he has. Neil Broderick says Elvis is credited as co-writer on 10 songs out of 800. When he sang in the ghetto, he was out of the blue. He what was that? In the ghetto, he out of the blue added, and his mother cried, and his mother cried. I didn't know that. No. Did I sound like him then? Did it just come across like as though Elvis and his mother cried? No.
Well,
okay.
I believe that because, I mean, he used to ad-lib a lot when he was live, you know, the famous one with I Lonesome Tonight, and standing there without any hair. You know, so and it's like the Beatles. When you watch that Get Back, you realise, you know, they weren't clinically written, those songs going into the studio, which is why some of those very strange lines, you think, well, that's interesting, that's stream of consciousness. It was just them particularly Lennon, fooling around in the studio, and the line stays in. It's like occasionally when somebody laughs at the beginning of a track, and the producer keeps it in the feedback. I feel fine.
Isn't it? Standing there with no way. Tennis Paparak all the way from Tampa. Elvis died on my 12th birthday.
Wow.
Was on a recliner at my grandparents' house in Durban, Michigan, recovering from the after spraining from my ankle and cutting my head playing football with my buddies. And I thought 13 was supposed to be the unlucky number. That's mad, that, isn't it? That's absolutely. Isn't that sad, though?
Yeah.
Isn't that, there's Elvis, and we've always got like something to remind us of when Elvis died.
That's right. I remember where I was. I was on the way to Cornwall, and I was staying over with my brother in Cardiff.
There was a fella named, I forget his first name, but something Woods, BBC report, not a reporter, the newscaster. And he came out, and he always has a miserable gob. This fella, always a miserable gob. And he said, Elvis, that's how I got to know, just sitting there watching the news of Elvis dying in August 1977. And Charlie Woods says, I thought Elvis was in the room then, Frank. And my mother cried. That came from you, don't it?
Perfect. He's not left the building yet, Frank.
What?
He's not left the building yet, then?
No, he has. No. And as Charlie says, Peter Woods, it was Frank. Yeah, you're right, Peter Woods. I knew his name was Woods, but I always forget it. But he was a miserable sod. He could have been talking about, I'm not talking about Elvis's death, but he could have been talking about how lovely people were enjoying themselves in Disneyland or whatever. And he'd still have that miserable gob. Never ever seen him smile or anything. Anything at all. Anyway, Derek, who will you talk about next? Because this is fascinating. The next time you're on. Yeah, because
Stevie Marriott's somebody that's got quite an interesting background. And Small Faces, I mean, what a classic group they were. Tragic group in a way.
Live, they were,
absolutely.
Steve Marriott, Small Faces. Yeah. I thought they were absolutely brilliant. Yeah. Seeing them live. And they were that type of band. You just want to, I don't know, how can I put this? You want to know more, don't you? You want to know more. And, the split up and everything else of them. And that was a downer for me when they split up. It was a downer for me when the Beatles split up. A few bands when they split up. And it's like watching a TV series. I always used to watch, I know it sounds madly, Hello, Hello. And when the cast starts to disappear and the new members come out, I stop watching it. And it's like Dad's Army. When, the Private Walker, never watched us after that because you can't replace them. You can't replace the originals. And it's like anything, this like Paul McDonough, a good friend of mine, he's Elvis. He's not Elvis. He's John Lennon. And, you can't I don't know. I'm not decrying Paul or anything, but he is John Lennon. He's unbelievable. But they're not the real people.
Hmm.
But you like to listen. I love to listen.
Oh, absolutely.
I love to Paul because it brings back the memories of the Beatles.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And often what you're hearing, you're actually not hearing what you're hearing, what you're listening to. You're hearing what's in your head, sort of waving across that. So, you know, you actually are hearing the original thing as well as while you're listening to the actors.
Well, would you agree with this? I'm not talking about the Beatles. I'm talking about any tribute band.
Hmm.
There used to be a fella, a Canadian, I think his name was Larry someone, and he did the Big O. He did, and I went to see him. I don't know whether I went to see him on the Playhouse or the Royal Court. I'm not quite so sure. And anyway, I went. I think it must have been the Royal Court. So, and he just sounded like him.
Hmm.
Now I thought, and he looked like him. You know, when he came out on stage, well, we were sitting right back. But when he came out on stage, you know, because it was all like, you know, the way we always visualised the Big O, you know, with dark stages, and you know, and he's all in black with his shades on, and he just stance and everything, and he was absolutely amazing. But what I'm saying is, the likes of these people, these tributes, would you agree with me what I'm going to say here? They have to be spot on to sound like them.
Yeah.
So they have to sound like them when records came out, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and they need to look like them as well. And that's the difference between, you know, a band covering somebody else's song. You can improvise a different guitar solo, and so you should from time to time, because you play what you feel, as it were. But if you're a tribute act, I think, you know, to be a tribute act, you need to be as close to the original in looks and particularly in sound as possible. I mean, some of these Elvis impersonators are absolutely incredible.
Like myself.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I mean, you laugh.
All on the show tonight, Frank.
But anyway, we've got to fit there. Let's see what Neil says. Always thought Frey rated Rogers. What a voice he had. Yeah.
And Kossoff, the guitarist.
Oh, yeah. Talking about him the other week, weren't we? David Kossoff's son.
Yeah. Paul.
Yeah, Shelley Wood. Steve Marriott had a band called Humble Pie.
Yeah.
He said, we're changing our name to Pie. But he goes on. And he carries on by saying, oh, no, he doesn't. But he says, when asked why, he said, we're not so bloody humble anymore. How about that?
Very good.
How about that? I didn't know that. And Badfinger would be good subject, says Neil Broderick.
Yeah, they've got a very interesting, tragic story.
Yeah.
Absolutely tragic. Another manager seriously not doing the right thing.
Well, Badfinger were great, weren't they?
Oh, they were good.
You wanted that's they sang that, didn't they?
And you know, it was Mal Williams that introduced Badfinger to Apple. It was one of the things that Mal Williams did after the Beatles stopped touring. He carried on. I mean, he was in the recording studio with them on all kinds of tracks, hitting things and clapping things and all kinds of stuff. And one of the other jobs he did, he was sort of talent scout for Apple label when they set it up. And Badfinger were one of the first people he signed up to them. Yeah.
So Mal used to go around, just listening in the studios and what I said. He's a good odd.
Well, he produced some Badfinger stuff. I can't remember the name of it offhand, but one of Badfinger's hit singles was actually produced by Mal. And in fact, that's what the label credit says: produced by Mal, M-A-L. No full name, no surname. Produced by Mal.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. So, right. Anyway, I've got to finish. So who are we talking about next?
Stevie Marriott, Humble Pie, Small Faces.
Marriott, just that, you know, for everyone to listen to, because, you know, Badfinger would be a good subject, says Neil Broderick. Charlie Wood says George Harrison plays on a couple of Badfinger tracks.
Oh,
so,
that's right.
So, okay, well, we could. That's a future one then, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe do Marriott next, and maybe do Badfinger the following that.
Yeah.
Unless somebody particular comes up, so somebody dies.
That's great. Yeah, yeah. Well, we always go off on a tangent anyway.
That is very true.
Then getting back to Tommy Shandstamp, but we always now we knew what happened to him anyway. So that's the main thing. What happened to Tommy? Yeah. So anyway, Derek, thank you so much, and I'll see you in a week or two.
Absolutely, really enjoyed it, Frank. Cheers. Have a good day, mate.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Cheers, everyone.
That's lovely. Thank you, Derek. You're a good man, really.